Perfect. So thank you all so much. Hello again, everyone. Hola familia. Espero que estén bien. I hope everyone's doing well today and taking care on this warm day here in the East Coast, at least in Connecticut, where I'm at currently, New Haven, Connecticut. My name is Cristian Milian Santiago. I'm a current Woodbridge Fellow, so essentially a higher education administrative fellow within the Office of the Secretary and VP for University Life here at Yale University. I'm also a graduate of the class of 2021 here at Yale. I graduated from Yale College with a bachelor's in ecology and evolutionary biology, as well as a certificate in education studies. This project, as Manuel already stated, is a culmination of research that we've done over the past year plus. So I'll leave it off to Manuel to give a brief introduction as well.
As Puerto Ricans, family is very important to us. And within the concept of the Ley de las Siete Partidas, what we're talking about, maintaining the family unit, whether it was a slave unit or a freed slave unit, was critical in medieval Spain and Andalusia. And so we're going to look at that. So we present ourselves here in terms of our families. You have a picture of me with my family, and you have Christian with his family. As we get deeper into this, you'll know a little bit more about us. But when we did our DNA run, my brother came up with 27% Amerindian, 24%, etc. So we'll talk about how these heritages come together, blend together to make a Puerto Rican people.
Thank you, Manuel. We'll also be looking at the effects of coerced labor in Puerto Rico, particularly negritud, blackness, trigueñidad, essentially being of mixed race or being perceived as such, y blanqueamiento, so whitening, Puerto Rican racial identification specifically. We'll also examine how legal regimes and labor policies were used, including the encomienda system, the use of slave labor, and the libreta or passport system of coerced white labor. The event format will be as follows. So Manuel and I will present until around 5:15 p.m. Then we'll leave the floor open for any questions that you may have. So please be sure to write down or even type in the chat if you want to use that to react, as well as have your questions there for later. Feel free to use the chat as you please. We're going to leave it open. And we also ask that you keep your mics muted so that we're able to kind of go through the entire presentation. And yeah, until we arrive at the end of the seminar so that we can do a Q&A. We thank you all so much again for being here today. Thank you. And of course, if you'd like a copy of this PowerPoint presentation or of our much larger PowerPoint that I think is right now well above like 300 something slides, feel free to email either of us or both of us at the following emails, and we'll copy and paste these in the chat towards the end of the presentation. Thank you so much. So our presentation will have the following format. So we're going to start by chatting about a few foundational terms and a Spanish/Muslim history. Then we'll move into a brief history on the Taino peoples of Puerto Rico, the indigenous peoples who resided there prior to colonization. We'll move into a discussion on negritud on the island, blackness and its perceptions, notable figures, blanqueamiento, whitening, trigueñidad, sort of what we've termed right now as triracialism, this idea of kind of racial ambiguity in language that has been used to kind of identify individuals throughout history within the context of Puerto Rico y otras islas del Caribe. And lastly, we're going to talk about el movimiento afrodescendiente, the Afro-Boricua movement that exists on the island today. I'll leave it off to Manuel for this slide.
This is a look of an actual slave registry. You can find these in the Schomburg collection in New York. which is where we wanted to get them electronically. This is a slave, Tomas, in the department of Arecibo, in the city of Matillo, in the 1860s. And if you look at your left, you'll see the beginning, what would be called racial classification, stratification in Puerto Rico. Tomas is a slave who is color mulatto. The word mulatto appears here in this document, but will begin to disappear in the politics of Puerto Rico, replaced with a new word, the color of wheat. The word wheat in Spanish is trigo. The color of trigo is brown, and the new word will be trigueño. Those who were brown did not like to be called mulatto. They identified themselves as trigueño, a word that becomes dominant in Puerto Rico in the 19th century and to this day. It's just commonly used. The word mulatto is not used commonly on the island today. You note that they begin to identify this mulatto by his hair type. So every slave would have this definition. Here, the mulatto's hair type is negro lacio, which is black hair, natural hair, straight hair. La barba, beard, ninguna, none. Ojos, brown, castaño. Nariz perfilada, nice Anglo Spanish perfilada profile. Ojos, we said, and boca, the mouth, regular. So you can begin to actually picture each slave from the way they're being characterized without having a photo. And this served as a registry of every slave on the island. And this actual document of one of these towards the end of slavery. Slavery ends in Puerto Rico, March 22nd, 1873. Go ahead.
Thank you, Manuel. Now, this is an additional slave registry document from 1870 in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, which shows that Pedro, and I'll annotate the name really quickly because it might be a little difficult for people to see it. Pedro, as the name of the esclavo was, this slave in particular, lived in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and it states right here que él está coartado. So meaning that he has his freedom, has purchased his freedom. In the previous slide, we see, and I'll go back very, very quickly, that the individual in question, Tomás, no está coartado. And it says it aquí mismito, right down here. No está coartado. They actually wrote a no. And so coartado, essentially manumission. Slaves during this time were able to purchase their freedom through their labor. And so I'll go through this description, much like Manuel did previously. So his edad, his age is 24 years old. Estatura, his height, regular, color, their hair color, blanco, no, their skin color, blanco trigueño, which is really interesting because this is stating that this individual who has just purchased their freedom and yet was enslaved is an individual who would be perceived as white with a kind of light tan, which is why it states blanco trigueño. So more white than trigueño. You kind of start to see this weird melding of language and a lot of language that is utilized to racialize individuals. And we'll get into this in a little bit as well. Y el pelo castaño, essentially meaning chestnut or brown. La barba, aquí dice lampiño, which essentially means hairless. Ojos castaños, brown as well. Nariz regular y boca ideal. So this was an individual who would likely be perceived as white today. Y vamos a seguir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We start off with this concept of race is a historically, culturally grounded concept that varies from one society to another. Race taxonomies in Puerto Rico are constructed on the basis of phenotype traits such as texture of hair, you've seen that, skin tone, lip and mouth shape, and intermediate categories exist between white and black that are not represented in the United States Census or categories.
Now, to further explore this topic, we really need to begin with some terms that will ground this conversation. So here's a list of a few terms that relate to racial stratification. So the ways that individuals are identified racially, and racialize themselves in Puerto Rico to show how skin color and hair type, two of the features that were spoken about previously that Manuel highlighted, have played a role in the evolution of a racist vocabulary in Puerto Rico. So here I'll just read off a few terms really quickly. Tenemos grifo, light skin, yet kinky hair. Jabao, light skin, blonde, kinky hair. Prieto, plain black. También tenemos a lower down, blanco, moreno, negro, trigueño. Mulato, mixed race, typically white and black. Criollo, mixed race, typically Spanish born outside of Spain. Indio, Indian male, y India, Indian female. These are just a few of the many terms that we were able to find related to this kind of racial stratification and how language and certain phenotypic features are used to racialize individuals on the island of Puerto Rico.
But just wait for us. Go back that slide 1 second. There was a differentiation between the Africans, the non-Hispanic Africans, and the Hispanic Africans, the Africans who had been Hispanicized. And the word cocolo was used to describe those who were non-Hispanic African descendants and used as a pejorative term. Right. These terms give rise to all kinds of statuses. The most obvious status is libre, free, liberto, black freeman. Why is that important? Because the first blacks to arrive in Puerto Rico were free, and the majority of blacks in Puerto Rico will be free, either ab initio that came with the freedom, or they were through manumission able to purchase their freedom. Both the Quran and both the Ley de las Siete Partidas promoted freedom as the highest virtue. Moreno libre, free black. Pardo is then the term used for the intermixture of the European, the indigenous, and the West African people. And you'll see that a lot of the official documents. Pardo libre, the free mixed race black, whom today would be a trigueño. Blanquito, diminutive term used. Afrodescendiente is a contemporary term for those born of African descent. Afro-Boricua is also a contemporary term. Afro-Puerto Riqueño is a contemporary term. Bozal in Spanish means muzzle, as in the muzzle used for a horse. The bozal is the African brought from Africa to Puerto Rico, not Hispanicized, and the one more inclined to rebel. And you'll say all kinds of slave revolts occurring as the bozal population increases on the island. Cimarron are two types. The Spanish crown encouraged the slaves from St. Thomas to escape to Puerto Rico. And those would be known as cimarrones. That was feudist slaves. The other use of the word, and they founded, by the way, San Mateo de Cangrejos, which we know today in Puerto Rico as Santurce. So that was the original slave colony of escaped free slaves. They got their freedom once they came to Puerto Rico. Cimarron could also be a slave, a bozal, or a slave who escaped into the mountains in Puerto Rico. Esclavo, slave, meaning Slav, from the Latin. Negro Ladino, not Latino, with a D, Ladino, were those who after a year were deemed Hispanicized because they're now speaking Spanish, and they're all now also Catholic, part of the acculturation process. Coartación is what those documents referred to before, manumission, payment for your freedom on installment plan. Coartado is those are folks eligible for manumission. And that was a major part of the Puerto Rican slave regime, to get folks to freedom. So at the time Puerto Rico abolishes slavery, March 22nd, 1873, only 10% of the blacks on the island are slaves. All others are free.
Thank you, Manuel. So pictured here, we have in the front, specifically three of the individuals in the front are Segundo Ruiz Belvis, Jose Julian Acosta, and Francisco M. Quiñones. These are three individuals who were abolitionists during the abolitionist movement in Puerto Rico prior to 1873, when slavery was abolished on the island. And we've used the term triracialism for this talk. And what do we really mean by that? So from the time children start learning about history in Puerto Rico, they're taught that every Puerto Rican is a mix of three races: Spanish, Taino, or indigenous, and African, even when they may be more one race than the other, right? And yet the ways that we teach in Puerto Rico specifically, the ways in which it's taught about these ancestors, this ancestry, is presented with varying weights, where more weight is provided to the Spanish ancestry, while there is a diminishing of the indigenous and African ancestry, many on the whole. So now, what specifically do I mean by this? What is really taught in Puerto Rico? So social science textbooks present Spanish colonizers as innovators, who sought teaching the world by any means necessary, while native Tainos and enslaved Africans are often portrayed as these docile individuals, these docile people who were subject to the mandates and who never fought back, didn't really do much as a result of their current conditions. So now, what is the effect that this has on students, right? Individuals who are learning about their history, Boricuas. So while families are often content kind of spatting praise, and I think if we have any Latinos here, you may have heard this phrase at one point or another, hay que mejorar la raza. What does that mean, right? And oftentimes that's used as a term for in sponsorship of blanqueamiento or whitening, right? Tienes que mejorar la raza, be more Spanish, right? This over accentuation of the Spanish ancestry versus other ancestries. And there's often little discussion about the harmful effects of these narratives, right? Especially to their Afro-descendant members, to the Afro-descendant members of Puerto Rico, los Afro-Boricua. So now here, we'll just be showing these slides really quickly. So in the last two iterations of the US Census, the effects of valuing one history over another, which I mentioned previously, can easily be seen as people move away from identifying as one race to another, showing how this idea of mejorando la raza sometimes refers to kind of blanqueamiento or whitening, and has a real world effect on the social construction of race as a whole. So I'll show these two slides again, and I'll leave Manuel for any comment. We'll show 2010 very quickly in a separate slide so it's easier to see. Then we'll show 2020 as well. Pay special attention to the categories white alone, and then the mixed race categories. So white and black, black and other, and white and other. So this is in 2010. And then this is identification, self-identification by Boricuas on the island in 2020. Huge shift, right?
What happened to the whites? Did they disappear? No. There was a campaign in Puerto Rico to make people aware that it's okay to say who you are. And so the white category was almost wiped out, went down to 17.1%. People are much more aware today on the island on the importance of this census and your self-identifiers.
Thank you, Manuel. So we're now going to review some very relevant Spanish history that has a real world effect on these identifications and racial identifiers that we're talking about. Without having a look at this history, we won't really have a full contextualization of the conversation and where a lot of these terms arose from. So we'll now review some of this relevant history, and we argue that it has had an effect on the perceptions of race in Puerto Rico. So in the image on the left over here, you see Tariq ibn Sayyad, who died in 720 He was a Berber general, so Moorish general, Muslim Moor. He was a Berber general who led the Muslim conquest of Spain. In the 8th century Spain was conquered by the Arab Berber / African Moors. The first enslaved peoples from North Africa were brought by the Moors. Slavery in Al-Andalus, the former Islamic states in modern-day parts of Portugal and Spain, consisted of the Moors importing white Christian slaves from the 8th century until the end of the Reconquista, or kind of this reconquest, reacquisition of Spain by what would later become the Spanish identity in the late 15th century. So you have almost 700 years of control by Spanish Moors of Spain before the kind of white Spaniards who are coming in from Europe are coming to kind of take, quote unquote, take back this land, right? So what is the effect of this? So the Muslims followed the same technique as Romans to capture slaves. They sought cities to ally with them, and then they would end up taking eventually over 30,000 Christian captives from Spain. The Iberian Peninsula really served as a base for further exports of slaves and in other Muslim regions in Northern Africa. Slavery in Christian Iberia over the period from 8th to the 11th century consisted of Christian kingdoms gradually limiting their pool of slaves to Muslims from Al-Andalus. So you see kind of this reversal. Slavery in the medieval North mostly provided supplements to the workforce of free laborers and temporary laborers for special projects. In the 13th century, Christians reconquer the Iberian Peninsula, including portions of Spain, with thousands of Africans who became freemen as a result of this kind of conversion and change in leadership. Now, the image on the right over here, shows the Moors surrendering to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And this is a painting by Francisco Pradilla Ortiz. Specifically, it's showing this on January 2nd, 1492, when Muhammad the 12th of Granada surrendered the Emirate of Granada and the Alhambra Palace to the Castilian forces. Remember that date that I mentioned, January 2nd, 1492. So we have 700 years where the Muslims, the Moors, had taken over Spain, and then you have this reacquisition by Christians during the Crusades. Now, what is the history of slavery within Spain? That's also important for this conversation. Now, under Roman law, race was not the key to determine who was enslaved, but instead religion, as Manuel mentioned briefly previously. Now, Roman laws existed subjugating slavery, which included the sources of slaves, their conditions, and the possibility of liberation. In addition, the normal pattern was to prohibit people from enslaving someone within their same religion. So as I mentioned previously, the individuals who were in Spain, right, were enslaving individuals who were Muslim, and vice versa. The Muslim Moors were enslaving individuals who were Christian. Now, the Visigoths, who would end up taking over Spain during the Reconquista, practiced slavery before they even came to Iberia, and continued to practice it after their arrival, using a system of slavery similar to that of Romans with some modifications. And a notable difference in their usage is that unlike Romans, who only used them in the military and kind of support roles, these slaves, the Visigoths used slaves as active fighting troops. In 1442, Pope Eugene IV gave Portuguese the right to explore Africa. Now, what does this do? Spain's exposure to people of color over the centuries is believed to have accounted for positive racial attitudes, or slightly more positive racial attitudes, in the New World. Now, historian Robert Martinez thought it was unsurprising that the first conquistadors actually intermarried with the native Taino and later with African immigrants. And the Catholic Church played an instrumental role in preserving the human dignity and work for the social integration of Puerto Rico. The church insisted that every slave be baptized and converted to the Catholic faith. Church doctrine even held that the master and slave were equal before the eyes of God, and therefore brothers in Christ, with a common moral and religious character. Cruel and unusual punishment, for example, of slaves was considered a violation of the commandment. And now I'll pass it off to Manuel for the following slide.
The essential law, unlike the United States, which has to go find slave laws somewhere. There were slave laws in Spain that will be brought to Puerto Rico and will be enforced in Puerto Rico all the way through 1873 for the 4 centuries of Spanish rule. And these came from the Law of the Seven Divisions, or Law of the Seven Parts of King Alfonso X, who developed this from 1256 to 1265. The basic principles here are totally different from what the states were implementing. Firstly, in Partida 4, Title 5, the Partida, the law, the organic law, says slavery is the most evil and the most despicable thing which can be found among men, because man, who is the most noble and free creature among all creatures that God made, is placed by it in the power of another. Slavery was not viewed positively. Servitude was seen as an agreement and regulation, which according to Partida 4, lay 1, which people established in ancient times, by means of which men who were originally free became slaves and were subjected to the authority of others, contrary to what? To natural reason. Was violated natural law. The ley de ciertas partidas set is essentially, quote, all creatures in the world naturally love and desire liberty, and much more do men who have intelligence superior to that of others. It told the judges passing on these issues. It is a rule of law that all judges shall aid liberty for the reason that it is a friend of nature, because not only men, but all animals love it. The power which every man has by nature to do that which he wishes is liberty, except where the force of law or fuero, which is privilege, prevent him. And so the basic principle of this law, of this regime, we have the next slide. Is that the next one? Is that servitude is the vilest and most contemptible thing that can exist. That is the view of slavery. And that is the view, because that is the norm, the peremptory norm. There has to be in the slave law, manumission, a way to get out of slavery. That was manumission. You could purchase it or be granted it. And this was similar to what the Quran will also be saying. Not this statement, but there must be a way out. Can we save the questions till the end?
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. In the Quran, which again was the dominant religious moral force in southern Spain for over 7 centuries, there's no single Quran verse that calls for the abolition of slavery. But one of the strongest proofs of its intent to abolish slavery gradually is in chapter 90 of the Quran, where God gives believers a choice between 2 paths. Next slide. The righteous will travel on the steep path, and the unrighteous will travel the other. God asks believers, what will make you know what the steep path is? That's what will get you to heaven. Answer, it is the freeing of a slave. The verse suggests strongly that it's incumbent on the righteous to free slaves. If in a society of slaves, every believer is encouraged to free slaves, then eventually it is presumed the slaves of the world would disappear. So the Muslim concept also pushes the Roman concept of manumission. You need to free the slaves to free your soul. And to the extent that there is slavery, there must be regulation. Totally different what's happening in the North American experience. Okay. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Manuel. So we'll now place some focus on the interactions that the Taino, the indigenous peoples of and populations of Puerto Rico prior to Spanish conquest, the interactions that they had with Spanish conquistadors. So when the Spanish settlers, and this is a map, it says top mapa cacical de Puerto Rico. Los caciques, these individuals who were named caciques were essentially typically men, but there were some female caciques. I believe they were named cacicas who led each of these portions of the island. So this is split up across what were essentially these different rulers across the island. These individuals who had the most power within their particular group in the island, so Taínos specifically. So when the Spanish settlers first came in 1508, since there's no reliable documentation, anthropologists estimate that the number of Taínos, so these indigenous peoples that lived there and resided there prior to Spanish conquest, they believe that the number of those individuals was anywhere between 20,000 and 50,000. But maltreatment, disease, flight, and unsuccessful rebellion ends up diminishing this number to around 4,000 by 1550. So drastic difference. And then by 1544, a bishop counts that there are only 60 individuals who are Taino or would be identified as Taino, but these two were soon lost. So at their arrival, the Spaniards expected Taino Indians to acknowledge the sovereignty of the King of Spain by payment of gold tribute. And they would work and supply provisions of food and observe Christian ways. This is what the Spanish expected. Now, the Spanish under the encomienda system, which places Taínos under Spanish control by imposing Spanish hierarchy, essentially took forced control over the labor of the Taínos. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V also gives the right to enslave anyone who is not a practicing Christian, known as the Dum Diversas, and influences Spanish enslavement of indigenous Taínos. I'll now pass it off to Manuel to make any additions.
Those who are familiar with Puerto Rican history know the theory is that the Arawaks who dominated the island came from the Venezuela, from that area, came up the Lesser Antilles, all the way up to the Greater Antilles and the archipelago of Puerto Rico, Borinquen, which they dominated. This theory, this alleged theory that the Spaniards effectively eliminated all Taínos makes no sense. Today we know that many Puerto Ricans are in fact, can trace DNA back to the indigenous population of the island. In my case, 27% of our DNA is indigenous Puerto Rico, 22% Spain, 21% Portugal, 8% Basque, 4% Senegal, 2% Nigeria, 1% Cameroon, France 4, Northwestern Europe 3, Wales 2, Norway 1, and yes, David, 2% Jewish. We have a mix going on here. And if we did that across the entire population, you're going to find similar numbers. That is to say, the Taínos abandoned what you see on this map, the coastal towns, and headed for the mountains. There was no census in the mountains. The Spaniards didn't get to the mountains. If you go to Utuado today, in the mountain, you will find an original ceremonial site. Again, not touched by the Spaniards. So this theory of Spanish scholars of the period that they eliminated all Taínos doesn't make sense in terms of the genetic information we have today. What does make sense is this encomienda system, which is 3 forms of coerced labor in Puerto Rico. And there are 3 forms of coerced labor. This is the first one. It's called the trustee system. The Taíno will be entrusted to the Spaniard and to be educated, to be Catholicized, to be taught Spanish, and return servitude by that Taino. The result, the seas, primarily oppressive conditions, and you decimate at least quickly 1/3 of any population. It occurred here and will occur again in the invasion of the Spaniards of Mexico, in the invasion of the Spaniards of the empire of the Inca in Peru. Let's go back to the date, 2nd January 1492. For 700 years, the Spaniards purported to do a reconquista. That makes no sense. Nobody has a reconquest for 700 years. Don't take 700. It just doesn't happen. The 100 Years' War had already been ended, and the reconquista continued. Makes no sense. What you had was a stalemate between two hegemonies. You have the religious Muslims south and the Catholics north. And you had an effort to take back what had been lost in terms of the Visigoths. That's that history. What you have is the continuation of the militarization that had happened in Spain. And under the banner of Santiago Apostol, St. John the Apostle, known as Santiago Matamoros, killer of Moors, became the patron saint of Spain. They began to create crusades and alliances with Europeans to press and push out the Moors in southern Spain and eventually conquer Granada, the last emirate. Here, they arrived with the same kinds of tactics: conquer, seize, control the mineral wealth of Puerto Rico, which was what? Gold. By 1535, the gold had disappeared on the island. No more gold. But in 1511, the tribes rose up against the Spaniards and failed. They revolted. Puerto Rico has a tradition of revolt by the indigenous people, Taínos, and as you'll see, the Bozal, the African. Okay, it is not a so-called Pacific tradition. It's a tradition of battle that's waged in different ways and in different places. What we see here is the static map of what the Taino population looked like, the tribes at that time. What we don't see here are the mountains in the middle of the island, which are very difficult to access and where you can hide for long periods of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Now, on January 2nd, this date that I told you how to hold in your heads, but it might be a little difficult to at this point, so I'll revisit it. On January 2nd, 1492, Mohammed the 12th of Granada surrenders, essentially, right? Surrenders its kingdom. Spain, La Reconquista ends, and Spain is once again predominantly white and controlled by individuals or descendants of the Visigoths, which I mentioned earlier. Now, on October 12th of 1492, so that occurred previously on January 2nd, 1492. And on October 12th, 1492, after the 700 years of essentially being accustomed and acclimated to only having a culture based in war, Columbus lands in what is now the Bahamas, to then return in 1493. Now, at this point, Spain, as already mentioned, has been at war for hundreds of years. Meaning they came with arms and prepared to continue warfare, having just undergone this Reconquista. On November 19th of 1493, while on his second voyage to the New World, Christopher Columbus lands on the island of Borican, populated by 30,000 Arawak/Taino Indians, already mentioned. The first Black people who arrived in Puerto Rico arrived as freemen called libertos and arrived with Columbus in 1493 on the second voyage. Now, most libertos came from Sevilla, Spain, and libertos assisted the Spaniards in conquering the Taínos. In February 1495, Christopher Columbus, takes captive over 1,500 Arawaks, and about 550 of them are then shipped to Spain as slaves, with about 40% dying en route. Now, some additional history that I'll provide is focused on libertos, specifically Juan Garrido, who was a very famous liberto. In 1508, a liberto named Juan Garrido joined Juan Ponce de Leon to explore Puerto Rico and the prospect for gold. Now, what occurs in 1509? Garrido is the first free African man to set foot on the island, and he is a conquistador at this time who is part of Juan Ponce de Leon's entourage. In 1511, Garrido fights under Ponce de Leon to repress the Carib and the Taino. The Carib are another indigenous peoples that are less well known about within the context of Puerto Rico and indigenous history in Puerto Rico. Most individuals who have some trace of ancestry related to indigeneity in Puerto Rico, as mentioned briefly by Manuel, can link that to Taino indigeneity on the island. And now in 1511, right, he moves to repress with Ponce de Leon the Carib and the Taino, and they joined forces in Puerto Rico in a great revolt against the Spaniards. So this also goes against what is typically referred to as the noble savage myth, right? That individuals were very passive. There was no resistance from natives and from individuals who were enslaved and Black when it came to their position and positionality within the Spanish hierarchy, when that's just not true. And the history shows that. So another free African man, just really quickly, another free African man who accompanied De Leon, Juan Ponce de Leon, was Pedro Mejias. So we have Juan Garrido, who's mentioned, and then Pedro Mejias. Mejias marries a Taino woman, chief, a cacica, which was mentioned previously, and her name is Yuisa. Yuisa was baptized as Catholic so she could marry Mejias, and her name is changed to Luisa. This becomes the name of the town Loíza, which has the greatest proportion of Afro-Boricuas on the entire island. Now, when Spanish colonizers arrived, the area currently occupied by Santurce was baptized during the 16th century with the name Cangrejos. During the early colonial period, the indigenous Taino population was replaced by a small number of inhabitants, essentially criollos and Maroons. They were dedicated to agriculture and other activities, really mainly aimed at satisfying the needs of the nearby capital city, which, due to its lack of space and infertile land, made it mandatory to supply food through foreign trade with nearby towns. Now, cimarrones were African fugitive slaves. Maroonage, the flight of enslaved men and women from the harsh discipline, overwork, and malnutrition associated primarily with plantations was a common occurrence in the Americas and the Caribbean from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Originally believed to be of Spanish origin, cimarron, meaning fugitive, French marron, meaning brown, the term maroon is now thought to derive from a Hispaniola Taino root, meaning fugitive, which converged with the Spanish cima, meaning mountaintop. The term was originally applied to livestock in the Hispaniola hills and to fugitive Amerindian slave. And I'll leave it off for Manuel to add on as well.
This period is a period of non-population. You don't have, once the gold reserves are gone, 1535, Spaniards abandon the island and go off to Mexico or Peru to make their fortune. So we have a period where the island simply does not develop. A few folks are coming, but in 1510, slavery is officially introduced into the island. Remember, before then, we had a group of libertos, and now we have the introduction of slavery. And we have numbers with respect to all of that coming up. So when we get on to that.
So now the history of Afro-Puerto Ricans begins with the arrival of these African men, which we already mentioned, and were called libertos, who served alongside Spanish conquistadors. They were Christianized, spoke Spanish fluently, and could really move around to find opportunity in Puerto Rico. By 1820, there were about 104 free libertos in San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico. Though they outnumbered Spaniards at this time, opportunities to gain equal rights were limited, though, for them. Many could not have access to social institutions. They lived in restricted areas and had limited working options, even though they could move freely around the island. Now, this image right here, what this is showing, it's displaying a Liberto, the one that I mentioned previously, Juan Garrido, on his final trip with Hernan Cortés. Now, Garrido was alive from 1480 to 1550. He was born in West Africa. Although his history is not fully known, he's believed to be the son of a West African king, and he died in 1550 in Mexico. Now, Garrido was born on the west coast of Africa, 1487, and later moved to Lisbon, Portugal. He spent 6 years in Hispaniola, where the Spanish government allowed conquistadors to take land, people, and treasure. And in 1508, he joined Juan Ponce de Leon, as mentioned previously, on his mission to search for gold in Puerto Rico. Now, by 1519, Garrido was a veteran conquistador. He was a member of the Hernan Cortés expedition that invaded Mexico and actually laid siege on the Aztec capital at Tenochtitlan. Garrido ended up marrying and settling in Mexico City, and together Garrido and his wife had 3 children. In 1521, Garrido returns to Florida with Ponce de Leon, and they arrive with settlers, livestock, supplies, and weapons to control the natives. And before they're able to get settled, Native Americans once again run the Spanish off. And he dies a month later in Havana. By the end of his life, Garrido has served with the Spanish force for over 30 years. And he went on a final expedition with Cortés in 1533. And according to legal documents, Garrido dies in Mexico City sometime between 1547 and 1550. So apologies, not the Havana, Cuba mentioned previously. So he dies in Mexico. And I'll pass it off to Manuel.
The 16th century, again, is a small marker of what Puerto Rico will become. By the beginning of the 18th century, the population of Puerto Rico is 100,000, 1800s, okay, 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, the population of Puerto Rico is almost 1 million, 900,000. For all the previous centuries, we're talking of populations running in the thousands, 20, 30, 40, 50. It's not until after 1815 that you have a critical mass of what would be called a Puerto Rican people of Creoles. Here you have a sugarcane as one of the 4 or 5 major products that the Spanish determined they can farm and make some money out of. The others, tobacco, fruits, but basically all agricultural goods. During this period of time, Puerto Rico is assaulted by the English, who seek to take it and fail, by the Dutch, who seek to militarily take it and fail, and has a thriving contraband culture. So much so that the Spaniards would come to the shore to wait for the pirates to come over with their goods. One of those goods was the blade, and that blade was made in Manchester. And they didn't know how to say Manchester, so they ended up calling it machete. So the machetes were being brought in by the pirates. And since you didn't know, according to Enrique Laguerre, who tells the story, former professor of mine at the University of Puerto Rico, major Puerto Rican Trigueño novelist, since Puerto Ricans know what were being bought by the pirates, they never made shopping lists. And to this day, he says, we don't make shopping lists. We go into a supermarket, it's a form of exploration and discovery. But this period of the 1550s, 1560s, are simply transitional period of times where the population is too small, but more importantly, they're living together side by side as the island begins slowly to move away from San Juan, the capital, to the other regions of the island where they can grow foodstuffs or plant sugar.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you.
Now, the 17th century is characterized by a small migratory movement that really begins with the arrival of fugitive slaves from Danish, English, and Dutch territories. And this occurs as part of a royal charter issued in 1664 that promises freedom to all fugitive African slaves of non-Spanish colonies in America. Now, the purpose of the decree was not to try to promote the growth of population in Puerto Rico. It was to try to promote this growth of population, and it was also meant to weaken enemy countries of Spain in the New World and to promote agriculture. In 1673 specifically, where this table is taken from, the census groups inhabitants of San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, by casa or household. Now, a household might consist of people of different races and civil statuses, including white, enslaved, free Black, or individuals of mixed race ancestry, all living together under one roof. And the census identifies the head of the household and the relationship of the people living in that household to its head.
But again, if you look at, if you go back to that for a second, just look at the parallels. At the end, look at the enslaved blank, 19, add 98 to it, you got more Blacks or mixed race than you got white. This phenomena of Blacks outnumbering whites or equaling whites is consistent with what will be going on through the 19th century on the island. Here, we've already talked about San Mateo de Cangrejos. In 1759, two companies with 120 soldiers are organized in Cangrejos. Pedro Cortijo, captain of the company de Morenos, made up of 55 mulatto and Black soldiers, requests officially the separation of Cangrejos, independent party, part of Rio Piedras. So Blacks are finding a place where they can work parallel military scenarios, parallel to what the Spaniards were doing. But again, you still have this humongous underdevelopment of the island. Okay, go ahead.
And in 1784, Spain suspends the use of hot branding and provides ways by which slaves can obtain their freedom. In 1789, the Royal Decree of Graces sets rules pertaining to slaves in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. Later that year, a new slave code, also known as El Código Negro or the Black Code, is introduced. Now, despite these paths to freedom, from 1790 onwards, the number of slaves more than doubles in Puerto Rico as a result of the dramatic expansion of the sugar industry on the island. And every aspect of sugar cultivation, harvesting, and processing is arduous and harsh. And many slaves actually die on sugar plantations. Now, it's important to note that Puerto Rico also maintains a substantially free Black population by the mid-19th century. And by the mid-19th century, this free population represents nearly 40% of the total population on the island, continuously outnumbering the percentage of enslaved inhabitants. Now I'll turn it over to Manuel for a quick analysis of this slide.
Can you go spot the category?
Yep.
Descripción, okay. If you look at this carefully, you go, if you can make it, can you make that larger, the column? Is that as much as we got?
I can.
Okay. We went to the slave records and we went now to the baptismal records in Loíza. And if you look at, well, who is being baptized and who are the godparents? What is their status? So the first one is negro esclavo, right? If you get rid of the white, there's a white arrow there. Does that mean? Okay. Negro esclavo, adult Black slave. Next person baptized, slaves, right? Next, there's he, godfather, slave, el esclavo. She is free. The wife is free. The husband is a slave. Next, esclavo, husband again, slave. Ella, libre, she is free. Pardo, what does pardo mean? Intermixture, free. So that's a trigueño, pardo libre. Next one, negros libre. So both of them, mother and father, husband and wife, are free blacks. Previously, both of them were what? Free browns. Next, es el husband, slave. Ella, morena libre. Next one, pardo libertos. Both trigueños, both brown parents, free. Pardos libres again, both free. Esclava adulta, adult slave. Nothing said about the husband. Next one, esclava, slave. Next, as in female slave. Next one, esclavo, male slave. Next one, both of them are pardos. Next, you have esclavo, slave. Pardo libre again, pardo libre. The majority of these folks are free. El blanco. So the husband is white, she's brown. Next one, a pardo libre again, both brown free. Next are two whites. Next one, pardo libre, brown folk free. Next one, el moreno libre, the black is free, but the wife is slave. Okay, morenos libres, both of them are free. Esclavos, both of them are slaves. Next one down, both of them are white. Next one, he's free. And they have ella en duda. They don't know about the wife. Next one, two whites. Then moreno libres, esclavo. So this concept of color and freedom is all over the place. And it's captured. It's recorded. And you can go page after page after page of finding what? The basis to say that the majority of the blacks born were free, not slaves.
I'll also note really quickly that this is from the year 1792, and these are baptisms within Loíza, which is where the greatest percentage of individuals who are Black Boricua reside even today. So now this chart is really interesting. It shows the number of African slaves on the island from 1776 to 1827, and then the percent of the population that they made up. Specifically, individuals who are enslaved, individuals who are Black and free are not counted within this. So after we see a significant increase, right, from 1776 to 1827. Why is this? So after the introduction of the sugarcane industry, slave importation increases immensely. Between 1776 to 1818, the slave population increases drastically, as we can see right on this chart itself. Now, after the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804, the need for more Puerto Rican sugarcane plantations increases, leading to an increase in the need for individuals who are enslaved by the Spanish. Now, Puerto Rico slave owners were frightened of their slaves. They believed that the influence of the Haitian Revolution was due to have a terrible effect on all Caribbean colonies. And slaves actually end up revolting periodically on the island of Puerto Rico. The first revolt being the first revolt that's documented taking place in 1514 and actually being organized by individuals who were previously enslaved and Black and Taino indigenous Indians and natives. Now, between 1775 to 1873, Puerto Rico sees numerous revolts. There are 22 conspiracies that are reported between 1795 and 1844, and towns like Guayama and Ponce are become known for being towns in which individuals revolt constantly. Now, slaves would run away. They would find cimarrones, as mentioned previously. So previously, essentially fugitive slaves who would leave to the mountains in Puerto Rico. They would meet up with them, and then they would live in these mountainous regions alongside individuals who are of indigenous descent in Puerto Rico. And some would also even flee to other islands. And on May of 1848, General Juan Prim, Puerto Rico's then governor, issues the Bando contra la Raza Negra, this decree against the African race, which was mentioned briefly previously. Now, some of the repressive and punitive measures that are included in this decree were that any offense in which individuals of African descent were involved would be tried by military court, punished for taking up arms against anyone white through execution, cutting off of the hand, or jail time of up to 6 years if it's simply a threat that is perceived. And Black Puerto Ricans continue with attempts to free themselves from slavery on the island throughout this time and after as well. Now, during the 1500s, slaves that Spain imports to Puerto Rico and most of other colonies are mainly from the Upper Guinea region. However, in the 1600s and 1700s, Spain imports a large number of slaves from the Lower Guinea and Congo regions. Now, according to DNA studies, a majority of African ancestry among Black and mixed race Puerto Ricans comes from a few tribes. This includes the Wolof, Mandinka, Dome, Yoruba, Igbo, and Congolese, correlating to the modern day countries of Senegal, Mali, Benin, Nigeria, and Angola. Now, slaves come from all parts of the western coast of Africa, from Senegal, and from Angola, as previously mentioned. And in 1837, El Bando de Policía y Gobierno was enacted, forcing the landless, unemployed population of Puerto Rico to work on local plantations. In 1848, Governor Juan Prim, as mentioned previously, passes what's known as this Bando contra la Raza Negra, this proclamation or declaration against the African race. And its penalties are harsh, as mentioned previously and explained previously, for minor offenses. And in 1849, only a year later, the Reglamento de Jornaleros sustains low wages and forces jibaros, who are poor, essentially a peasant class in Puerto Rico, predominantly a white peasant class in Puerto Rico, to work. And this is an extension of legislation passed 12 years earlier, with the exception that the slave trade had deteriorated by this point. Now, the libreto system, as it essentially was known, begins in this year, 1849, and requires all Puerto Rican laborers to carry a document, regardless of race, to carry a document that identifies their employer and place of work. This document is intended to prevent workers from leaving their assigned plantations and to restrict their movements in other parts of the island. The libreto is also used as a way to track laborers who owed money and who were indebted. Now, by 1850, Puerto Rico was demanding independence, and with that, the abolition of slavery. Puerto Rico's independence movement works hand in hand with the abolition movement at this time in 1850. On the island, major players during this time in the labor system include jibaros, enslaved Africans, and individuals who are revolting. And oppression of Africans occurs through enslavement, and of poor whites, right, can be seen through this libreta system. So these two forces, the force towards independence and the force for liberation from slavery and abolition, go hand in hand. Now, this is a quick image of General Juan Pezuela, who is the individual who actually institutes the Black codes and the libreta system. And now this is what a typical libreta would have looked like. This is what individuals who were this peasant class and needed to kind of go around the island and couldn't have a whole lot of movement from employer to employer. This is what they would carry around. Now inside, you would have amounts paid, amounts owed by this individual, and comments even related to this worker. Now, these comments were related to their behavior, how good of a worker they were, any sort of complaints that an employer had regarding this worker, and would actually limit the opportunities for these poor workers and would limit this movement. And so right here you see it says semanal. Part of this in some other future iterations of the libreta, you see a label that says nomina semana terminada. Semanal just means week. So this is like the weekly, essentially a record. There would be a record on the front of the page of when individuals are getting paid and the terms within which they're employed.
Okay, let's go back to that for a second. Okay, we mentioned earlier the three periods of coerced labor on the island. The first was the coerced labor of the native Taino, which was coerced labor based on the concept of trusteeship or encomienda, which failed miserably. The second is formal slavery. And the third is the coerced labor of white or free people. Whites weren't free to move around. Whites who had no jobs could be assigned where they're going to be working. So this system begins to be in 1849. At the time slavery abolished, this system formally is abolished, but continues into the 20th century. What is this book? How does this book exploit a white worker, a jíbaro or peasant worker? Well, in the book, the standard technique in all migrant labor, even today, New Jersey, New York, California, elsewhere, is to advance wages for the needs of that worker and have them pay you back what you advanced, with or without interest. The idea is you kept advancing, they kept borrowing, and they were always in debt. They're not leaving that plantation. Their foodstuffs, etc., will be present here. So it's not simply a wage and hour book. It's not that. It's a way of capturing what's coming in and out. And it's coming in and out from 1849 all the way to when the Americans arrived. Because when the Americans arrive and they start taking over and creating huge plantations, they're using the libreta de jornaleros too. Jornalero is a day worker, is a worker. And they're working here on a weekly basis, but they're working here permanently. It's an immobilized workforce created by the Spaniards to deal with what? Their labor needs. Why is that? Because slavery is not amounting more to 8, 9, 10% of the population. The population is free. And how you then get workers to work? Well, you coerce them. This is a third form of coerced labor. Very important once you eliminate slavery.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you, Christian.
So since we're about to be at 5:15, I wanted to just let you all know that we have around 20 slides left, just for anyone's own planning. But we shouldn't take too long since we've provided, I think, ample initial context for the conversations that we're having now. And we'll kind of move a little more quickly through these. So thank you so much for being here again. Now, this image displays rebellions and conspiracies of rebellion by enslaved Africans that took place in Puerto Rico from 1795 to 1870. And that's what it states about rebeliones, rebellions y conspiraciones, and conspiracies de rebelión, of rebellion by slaves por esclavos in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico. Now, Marcos Ciorro was Puerto Rico's most famous conspirator who actually planned to attack multiple plantations, but whose plot was aborted. Rumors had it that he had requested military aid from Haiti even. Marcos Ciorro was the slave name of an enslaved African in Spanish Puerto Rico, who in 1821 plans and conspires to lead a slave revolt against the sugarcane plantation owners and the Spanish colonial government. It's not known whether Ciorro was born. It's not known when he was born or from what people and region in Africa he came from. But what is known about him is that he was a Bozal slave. So as previously mentioned by Manuel, he was a non-Spanish African brought over directly from Africa, Bozal slave. And Ciorro was enslaved by Vicente Andino, a militia captain who owned a sugar plantation in the municipality of Bayamon. And in July 1821, Ciorro plans and organizes a conspiracy against his slave masters and slave masters generally and the colonial government. This was to be carried out on the 27th of July of that year, 1821, during religious festivities dedicated to Santiago.
The slide you just saw, Christian, just bring it back for a second, is the most controversial slide in Puerto Rican history. It debunks the myth Puerto Ricans, Africans did not rebel. multiple rebellions, and multiple use of mountains for this rebellion. My wife relates the story of her town, Arroyo, where there was code word used by her own ancestors called La Torre del Abuelo, the grandfather's tower. And if one black toad said to another black, La Torre del Abuelo, they could be co-conspirators. Where's this Torre del Abuelo? Where's this tower? Tower's in the mountain. Yanuel, where a barrio from which her family claimed that had 1,300 population back in the 1800s, 1860s, and still has around 1,300 people, basically. Again, there were conspiracies ongoing, okay, among that part of the population that was still enslaved. Okay, thank you, Christian.
No, thank you for that additional context. So now, really quickly, what are the takeaways from this chart that I want you all to get? As you can see from the top, it's a Spanish royal census from 1827 to 1847. Now, what does this show specifically? So while you look at this chart, I'll be doing a quick overview of what the chart really shows. So if you go across this here, going to very quickly do this arrow. If you go to 1827, you see that the total number across mixed, free, and enslaved individuals, so individuals who are non-white, you see that total number is 161,000, 2,000 less than the number of individuals who are white. In 1834, you see that there are total across mixed, free, and enslaved individuals of 168,000, right? Still way less than the white population. But in 1847, when you take the totals across the columns mixed, free, and enslaved, you see that there are actually 619,000 individuals who are non-white on the island of Puerto Rico by this time. That means there's almost a 50-50 split across individuals who are white and identified as white, Spanish predominantly, and individuals who are identified as non-white on the island. We also see a drastic decrease from 1834 to 1847 in the number of people who are enslaved in Black, although an increase is seen from 1827 to 1834.
If you leave that there for a second, remember I told you that at the beginning of the century, 1800, 100,000 population. Look at how it balloons from 100,000. The Royal Decree of 1850 that promotes immigration to the island from where? From Louisiana, from Venezuela, from the conservative forces fleeing the revolutions where? In South America. Where are these conservatives coming with their money or goods? Coming to Puerto Rico. And these are principally white, wealthy Creoles from those colonies seeking independence. So the population balloons from 100,000, you got to here we're talking about 700,000. You're doubling it by 1850. Okay, so a huge population explosion, huge dynamic, and then all of this repressive legislation. When? In the 1840s.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you, Christian.
Now, the following document represents something that we covered previously, and these are baptisms in Loíza. The only difference that you'll see is that these are from 1843. The ones previously shown were from 1792. So we want to go back to the description of statuses, and you see that it largely has remained the same, except for there being a huge increase in the individuals who are labeled as libre. So this coincides with the previous slide that we just showed you, where there was a huge decrease in the number of individuals who were enslaved at that time and Black, and there was a huge increase in the number of individuals who are now free and Black as well on the island of Puerto Rico. So we see from straight almost all the way down, libre, pardo libre, moreno libre, 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 libre. We have one negra esclava, but for the most part, almost all of these individuals are either pardos libre or identified as being individuals who are Black and free at the time in 1843. So now moving on to the 19th century, And I love this image just because it's something that until we started kind of doing this research, it wasn't anything I'd seen before. So the following image this actually displays a protest by the Spanish Abolitionist Society in Madrid, Spain on January 12th, 1873. 2 months prior to the March 22nd abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico in that same year, 1873. Now, in 1855, years prior, Ramón Emeterio Betances founds the Sociedad Abolicionista Español, the Spanish Abolitionist Society. By 1867, Betances is implicated in the Grito de Lares revolt against Spain, which solidifies opposition to slavery. At the conference on the abolition of slavery held in Spain, the Puerto Ricans, Acosta, Belvis, and Quiñones submit a formal plan for the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico in 1867. In September 23rd of 1868, slaves who had been promised freedom participated in the failed revolt against Spain, which became known as this Grito de Lares that was mentioned earlier. This Grito de Lares translates to the cry of Lares. And many of the participants of this particular protest are either imprisoned or executed. The slavery then is abolished in the Spanish crown in 1870, 3 years before its abolition in Puerto Rico by the Moret Law. It sets slaves born between 1868 and 1870 free, and slaves over 60 are also set free under this law that predates the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico in 1873. And the Moret Law ends up freeing 10,000 slaves. And slavery is officially abolished in Puerto Rico on March 22nd of 1873, largely due to economic factors and the independence movement tied to anti-slavery movements in Puerto Rico. And by 1898, the U.S. annexes the colony. Early subsistence farming activities evolve into considerable wealth-generating plantation system, cultivating sugarcane, tobacco, and coffee. And I'll let Manuel talk about this document in particular.
This is an example of the indemnity paid by the government to slave owners. So those who had slaves received compensation from the government. This is from the Treasury of Puerto Rico, 100 pesos to the slave owner in compensation for the slaves. What did the slaves receive? No such compensation. In fact, instead of freedom on March 22nd, 1873, they were held for another 3 years so they could allegedly be prepared by their owners for freedom, presumably by accumulating cash towards that freedom, the needs related to freedom, but still being worked as if they were still slaves.
Thank you, Manuel. Now, this following document, we're going to go through this one very quickly because all we really want to show with this one, right? We've shown 2 baptism documents, one from the 1840s and then one from 1790s. This one is from 83 and includes only one individual, 83 and 84, and includes one individual from 87. What you see is that there is no category that relates to descripción y estatus, which are generally these descriptions and descriptors related to race that were used previously in baptisms in Loíza. So that's really what we want to show with this document. At this point, everybody's essentially considered free, and there really isn't that need for extreme categorization that was seen during this kind of primarily Spanish controlled identity and racial identity formation of individuals within this time. So individuals are not racialized the same as they are previously, but we do definitely see a change when the United States acquires and colonizes the island of Puerto Rico.
Thank you.
And this is Ramón Emeterio Betances. Disculpa. This is Ramón Emeterio Betances. And Betances in 1827, he's born on April 8th, 1827. This is one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement in Puerto Rico. He receives his medical degree in 1827 from the University of Paris. And upon his return to Mayagüez, he founded a hospital and worked to save Puerto Ricans from the ravages of the cholera epidemic. That year, he and others founded a society dedicated to the liberation of slaves, which I mentioned previously. And the Spanish colonial government exiled him for these activities multiple times. In 1867, he flees to what's now present-day Dominican Republic, where he founds the Revolutionary Committee of Puerto Rico. And the following year, he organizes an armed expedition that leads to the abortive insurrection, September 23rd, known as the Grito de Lares, which was also previously mentioned. He returns to France, where he serves as a delegate to the Cuban Revolutionary Junta, secretary of the Dominican legation, and he founds the Society of Latin American Union. Although he spends his remaining years away from his homeland, he viewed the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico on March 22nd, 1873, with amazing satisfaction. And for his contributions to literature, the French government awarded him its Legion of Honor. Betances dies in September 16th of 1898, and his remains returned to Puerto Rico in 1920, where they're buried in his birthplace. Now we're going to mention some other notable figures. Now, the Creole privateer from Puerto Rico, Miguel Enriquez, was not only the richest and most powerful Black businessman recorded in our national history, Puerto Rican national history, but is also that of the Caribbean, the richest of the Caribbean and the New World. His golden age was during the first few decades of the 18th century. In his life, he owns more than 300 ships with his own shipyard and is an owner of 13 houses in Old San Juan. He was appointed by the King of Spain, captain of sea and land. And he actually ends up gaining the title of knight through the Spanish crown. Miguel Enriquez is hired and paid. He hired specifically and paid for the services of correspondence in cities that were considered essentially vital to his interests. Now, what does this mean? Essentially, he was connecting with people who could keep him up to date with anything he was interested in. So that included Puerto Rico, business generally in the Caribbean itself and developments in the Caribbean, commerce, politics, and everything these individuals understood in particular that would be of vital interest to him. And so he manages at this time with no internet or any means of immediate communication to create an entire network that operates from Puerto Rico and is activated by his payments, with correspondence in Madrid, en Cádiz in España, the island of St. Thomas, Santo Domingo, Santiago, and Havana, Cuba, Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela, to name a few of the places that he actually had an insane influence over. And I'll pass it off to Manuel to speak about Rafael Cordero Molina.
What you're beginning to see is the fruit of a Creole Trigueño elite. They're not Black, they're not white, they're brown, but they are elite and they are in charge. They are productive. They are moving this island to a sense of self-definition. What you have here is the picture of Rafael Cordero Molina, who's self-taught and as a teacher, and who provided free education for children in Puerto Rico, and is known as the father of public education in Puerto Rico. His parents were artisans, free mulattos, trigueños, and he became the leading pedagogical figure on the island for Blacks and whites. Next.
Gracias, Manuel. Now, Rafael Hernández Marín was also known as El Jibarito. He was from Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. He was born on October 24th, 1892, and he died in San Juan, Puerto Rico in 1965. Now, he was born into a poor family, and he learned the art of cigar making as a child. He also learned to love music and asked his parents to allow him to become a full-time music student. At the age of 12, he studies in San Juan under the instruction of professors José Ruellan, Lequenica, and Jesus Figueroa. He learns to play many instruments, including the clarinet, the tuba, the violin, the piano, and even the guitar. At age 14, he plays for the Cocolio Orchestra. He moves to San Juan, where he plays for the municipal orchestra under the direction of Manuel Tisol. And in 1937, he writes Lamento Borincano, one of his greatest works. And that same year, he composes Preciosa, considered his ultimate masterpiece. Hernandez returns to Puerto Rico in 1947 after having been in Mexico, where he became the director of the Puerto Rican Symphonic Orchestra. He also works as a consultant during this time for the government broadcaster WIPR. And between 1956 and 59, Hernandez serves and is an honorary president of the Puerto Rico Association of Composers and Authors. And now I'll pass it off to Manuel.
Eduardo Sena Vanilla was a very well-known Puerto Rican anthropologist. And when you spoke with him, he raised all of these issues and asked that those who listened to him would fan the flame and keep these issues alive. The issue of intermixture, blanqueamiento, intermixture with the goal of so-called improving your race, is part of the parlance of Puerto Rican history. And he is the one who talks about the racial categories and the phenotypes and what have you. So that's part of the discussion. The intermixture, the dominance or importance of the Trigueño sector, the disappearance of the classifiers of mulatto, the integration of racial themes, but not to forget the harshness, the vileness of any institution of coerced labor, especially that of slavery in Puerto Rico or elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the term trigueño, trigueñidad, racial ambiguity, we've mentioned that this can mean mixed race, kind of indicates racial ambiguity, and I'll provide some more clear definitions on what we mean by trigueñidad. Now, the term trigueño is derived from trigo, T-R-I-G-O. Trigo literally means, trigo is wheat, and so trigueño literally means wheat colored, so kind of light brown. The term seems to have gained currency in the 20th century Puerto Rico and elsewhere in Spanish-speaking Latin America, including Argentina, Bolivia, Cuba, DR, Venezuela. And this describes people with a town or with its kind of tan or brown skin tone. And its meaning and social uses contain the same ambiguities inherent in all so-called race-related concepts, as race is not an objective fact of nature, but what might be called a social fact, a social construction with real-world effects. And these identifications are subject to power dynamics and the social hierarchies of races. Now, what are some uses of trigueño? How is this used? The term covers a wide range and variety of skin color types. It can be used to identify someone who is Black or Black identifying, someone who is kind of light skinned but still Black, someone who is brown, someone who is darker than white. And which meaning is ascribed in particular will depend on the factors such as who says it, in what context, in what country, and how the person's skin color is perceived in combination with other phenotypic markers, which we spoke about previously, including hair type and other phenotypic features. Now, the application of trigueño also can be influenced by the relationship between the person describing and the one who is being described, and by their perception of Blackness in particular. In a different context, a Puerto Rican might use trigueño to describe someone considered neither Black nor white. And depending on who uses it, how, and to whom they apply it, therefore, the use of trigueño can be interpreted as a polite gesture, as the sign of a condescending attitude towards Black or brown people, or as a phenotypic marker of racial mixture that lies somewhere between white and Black, and between kind of that racial continuum that is often perceived, that racial binary that is often perceived. Now, the following quote, el que no tiene dinga, tiene mandinga. The following quote is taken from Mujeres con Visión, a female-led online publication on the island of Puerto Rico. In the words of the author themselves, it wasn't until 1977 when I had the opportunity to take a class on Puerto Rican culture with the illustrious Ricardo Alegría and the recently established Center for Advanced Studies of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And they discovered the origin and significance of this popular proverb. The word dinga is derived from an Inca word, ancient indigenous founders of Peru, and the word mandinga is a reference to the first group of Africans brought to Puerto Rico as slaves and that presently inhabit Gambia, Senegal, Mali, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, to name a few countries. So thus the refrain has a racist connotation in its origin. It means that the person who has no Indian blood has Black blood. It is used to differentiate between the European population and the Americas, praising the first, right, this kind of Spanish ancestry and European ancestry, and degrading the second ancestry.
It's also
Now we'll talk.
it's also part of a phrase that every Puerto Rican knows, popular music. It's accompanied by another one. This was you pretend to present as white, and then the response is, well, are you really? The other way of doing it is, ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? And your grandmother, where is she? You say you're white, show me your grandmother. So both of them go to that scenario of passing. Okay, you want to pass? Well, you're not passing. Go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. So we'll talk a little bit about el movimiento Afro-Boricua, because we don't want to talk about this and Blackness within Puerto Rico as simply being history. This is not just history. It's something that still exists today, right? Blackness is not something that goes away. Perceived Blackness is not something that goes away. The racism that comes with that is also something that does not go away. So we really want to highlight the current existing history, right? The history that things that already occurred, and the current existing individuals really on the forefront of continuing to shape this appreciation for Puerto Rico's, especially African roots. So I'll pass it off to Manuel now to talk briefly about this slide.
Santiago Apostol Matamoros became the patron saint of the Spaniards. And that symbolism was taken by the African, turned around as a representative of Ogun, the god of war. Santiago was the god of war for the Catholics. The African took the same, Santiago Apostol, and in Loíza, every year they celebrate Santiago Apostol with these vejigantes costumes, honoring the Yoruba tradition of supporting Ogun, the Yoruba god. We have no time to talk about Santeria, but one of the legacies of the Africans in Puerto Rico is the importation of a religion which syncretizes the Catholic saints with the Yoruba Oshiri. So that's also part of what you see here. You heard at the beginning the sound of the bomba, the music, which is our music, but originally African music. Unlike the North Americans who took away the instruments from the African because they were afraid they would be used to communicate, which in fact they were allowed to be used in Puerto Rico. And from the barrels, they developed a conga drum on the island and communicated and danced and created our most powerful native dances on the island. Obviously, you have a picture on the right of Roberto Clemente, a major hero of Puerto Rico who died tragically trying to aid Nicaragua after the earthquake.
Now, led by local organizations, Colectivo Ile and Revista Étnica, 45 groups in Puerto Rico united and marched forward with one goal in mind, and this was to grow the Puerto Rican population who identifies themselves as Black. This is a quote taken directly from this particular article that we're pulling from, and we'll share all of these slides after with all of these different sources that we have. So Barbara Abadia Resach states, I think that the main issue in Puerto Rico is colonialism, and that's where racism comes from. And through that, there's been a chain reaction of oppression, discrimination, and dehumanization. And with the slogan, no te quedes en blanco, don't remain in the white, The Colectivo ILE and Revista Étnica's 2020 census campaign set out to simply educate people about how to fill out the race section of the census survey, inciting them to move past white and into the nuanced realities of race, specifically within the context of Puerto Rico. For months, they visited communities, they visited communities across Puerto Rico to teach them about the options available and what they meant, from choosing two or more races to simply selecting Black. And amid the pandemic, they also held virtual panels with schools, universities, and local community boards. Their work helped people put the issue in perspective. And they state, the United States doesn't see us as white, so why play that game?
We don't have much time, but Silvia del Villar is one of our greatest exponents of Afro Boricua dance, and truly a powerhouse of talent, who studied in the States at Fisk University, City College, but joining the ballet group Africa House in the States, but focusing on the African roots of the Yoruba people of Nigeria, and bringing that back to the island.
And this was actually Silvia's favorite poet, Luis Pales Matos, who is a Puerto Rican poet and essayist, and he played an outstanding part in bringing Afro-Antillean poetry to the public eye. By his use of African intonations and dance rhythms, he actually popularized Afro-Boricua poetry.
And that's what you heard at the very beginning of this seminar. His poem to the bomba beat. Julia de Burgos, one of our greatest poets from Carolina, Puerto Rico, advocate of Puerto Rican independence, goes off to New York, dies in New York, and leaves a legacy of poetry, which is unbelievable, and is the namesake of the Yale Puerto Rican Latina Cultural Center.
And now we'll play a quick video for all of you, and we'll move right into our Q&A. Thank you so much again for all of your patience as we went over. Thank you.
Un instrumento, un espacio para rebeliones, ¿verdad? Sirvió antisistémica, antirracista, anti todas esas opresiones que significaba ese sistema esclavista que había en esa época. Hoy en día, pues, la música sigue siendo un espacio de libertad y sigue siendo un espacio político de transformación. A bailar.
Me acuerdo que cuando mi mamá me puso esa ropa, yo me sentí que yo era el video. Yo, ay Dios mío, me encontraba tan bonita. Wow, este es algo con lo que yo me puedo identificar, esto soy yo, esto es parte de mí. Santurce se convierte en el primer lugar de donde estaban ubicados los esclavos libertos. Loíza se vuelve en el pueblo donde mayor concentración de negros hay.
Esta cueva es una muy antigua y es uno de estos lugares a donde las personas escapadas de la esclavitud, como los cimarrones.
Bailárselo pues me gusta también, pero me da mucha más alegría cuando estoy con mi hermana. Y qué alegría, ¿verdad? También estar juntas.
La influencia taína la vemos en los términos como la maraca, el cuá. La maraca, el cuá mantienen el ritmo constante, igual que los tambores. Y el primo, ese es el que improvisa. Una comunicación entre bailador y tocador.
La familia Cepeda fue una de las muchas familias que mantuvieron el baile y el legado vivo.
El primer maestro que nosotros tuvimos fue don Rafael y doña Caridad. Fueron los primeros maestros que nosotros tuvimos, que nos enseñaron a cómo era esto. Papi siempre estaba diciendo que cuando Puerto Rico comprenda el valor del folclore, luchará con mucha fuerza para defender su honor. Él siempre luchó mucho porque se reconociera esta música que era tan marginada y olvidada, porque es música de trata negra. Música negra, tú sabes, la música de abajo, de barrio.
Antes la bomba era, se bailaba y se conocía y se tocaba nada más que en familia.
¿Dónde está mi Congo, mi fiel?
Ahora es que ha cogido un auge bastante grande. Te lo pueden bailar en la playa, como te lo pueden bailar en una tarima, te lo pueden bailar en una casa, donde sea.
Pa' que lo bailes tú también.
Thank you so much for being with us all. And again, if you want a copy of this PowerPoint or have questions, we have these emails up right now, but don't worry, I'm going to stop sharing screens, stop the video, and I'll put these in the chat to make it a lot easier for everyone. And we can move into our Q&A session for those of you who have the stamina for it. But thank you.